Okay, well, 5 years ago today, I was living in Nairobi, Kenya, where I had been working in microfinance, rating banks across the continent, and I kept coming across the same problem. Banks were lending in euro and dollar, getting loans from development institutions, and on lending in local currency. And I was just in Kigali last week and talked to one of the banks that I had seen 10 years ago when I first came on the continent, and he told me the problem still existed. He's lending in euro, he's on lending in Rwandan franc, which sounds great until the currency pair slides over across the year, and the bank has no chance of breaking even. And there's no swaps available except from one from the central bank at 6%. Because of the lack of liquidity, you're really unable to access local currency products as you would in other markets. So I created BitPesa as a way to increase liquidity in the Kenyan shilling. Pesa means money in Swahili, and bit at the time referred to Bitcoin. So I figured if I'm doing a startup and I want to be cashless, how do I make a market in Kenyan shillings without having correspondent bank status, which is the way most people make a market in FX, going through the SWIFT system in the US dollar. So I became the first company in the world to make a market between Bitcoin and an African currency, and the first to make a market between Bitcoin and mobile money. Fast forward 5 years later, we're operating on 3 continents, in over 12 markets, 8 just in Africa alone. And we are still focused on creating liquidity in frontier market currencies, but now we're focused on businesses and helping them grow even when they have to do cross-currency transactions. So why does increasing liquidity in frontier market currencies really grow businesses? And what's the problem with liquidity in these markets? Let's take a look at this old-fashioned map of the world that I got on Google. So if you're lucky enough to live in a large enough country, and by large I mean geographically, like some of them, or large enough economically, like the UK right now, yeah, haha. You're lucky enough to maybe live your whole life in one currency. So unlike the sexy Revolut user who's looking at all his different currency expenses, many people just get paid in pounds sterling. They pay their rent in pounds sterling. They buy their milk. They order from Deliveroo, all in pounds sterling. Great for you. Other people who might get on a train or a plane to Paris or deal with a company in Montreal really have to start to think about how you do that cross-currency transaction. But these are all hard currencies that I named. It's easy to trade in and out of them. I was working in Malawi, and every time I finished a trade trip, I'd come home with a pocket full of kwacha. Now, there's not a lot of currency pairs in the world, maybe none, that begin with the Malawian kwacha at the start. It's never really been a strong currency, unlike the pound sterling. So it's at a disadvantage. And if you want to go from the Malawian kwacha to other currencies around the world, let's say you're importing electronics from Dubai or China, or manufactured goods from South Africa, or exporting tobacco like they do, you really are stuck first converting that currency into the US dollar, using the correspondent bank system like SWIFT, and then finally reaching your destination currency. And most African banks, Tier 2 and Tier 3, don't have correspondent bank status. And Christine Lagarde at the IMF has spoken widely on how de-risking really affects banks in emerging markets. In fact, 2 correspondent banks have dominated, almost monopolized transactions in and out of the African continent for the last few decades, which is the reason why Africa's cost of transactions is double that of the next frontier market region. And it's the reason why friction restricts the growth of businesses. And I'm not just talking about microfinance businesses in Malawi. I'm talking about United Airlines into Nigeria. So let's recap that for a second here. So high friction transactions, that means the cost is high. Let's talk about the speed for a second. Averaging 2 to 12 days is normal. And a lot of our customers tell us that 1 out of every 5 transactions is stuck. What do I mean by stuck? BitPesa alone had a $700,000 wire stuck for 27 days. Now, we are not a unicorn. At the time, it was a huge part of our cash flow. We had to use considerable expense, time, effort to get that SWIFT wire found. And what had happened? Well, some employee in one of the banks had mistyped our account number, and it was missing. High barrier to entry. When you have this amount of friction, not a lot of companies really want to go there, and other companies exit. So what ends up happening is you have monopolies dominate, and maybe they have access to certain things that other companies don't. So it becomes almost impossible to break the status quo. yet the growth potential is there. In the next 20 years alone, 1.1 billion working age individuals will be in the African continent. It'll be the biggest population of the working age demographic around the world. And over 200 million adults will be moving from rural areas into urban and peri-urban areas, coming online and joining the digital economy. And if you talk to global treasurers, which is what Deloitte did, you can see that when going into frontier markets, FX volatility is the #1, but repatriation and liquidity are right up there. And repatriation is a problem when governments restrict liquidity. They think, okay, to combat FX volatility, we'll do a peg, or we'll control it in some way, but that again is this horrible cycle that really prevents liquidity from happening. So how do we get past this? How do we really unbreak the cycle? And here's where BitPesa has a hybrid model. Instead of competing directly, we have created, using technology, a way to digitize and innovate a model that already existed. There already were ways to pool and transact informally. The black market, or the Aboki market in Nigeria, the Hawala market in East Africa, has been famous for generations. It's what we use when we can't have access to the correspondent bank system. But why hasn't it been grown? Why haven't banks looked at it? Why haven't they figured out that there is a way to kind of use something besides the SWIFT technology? Well, a lot of the time, it's been considered run by family businesses or small entrepreneurs. And there was this reputation that perhaps it was illegal or encouraged money laundering. And what we've really shown is that using technology, we can get past that reputation, and we can show not only are we as compliant as the bank, but we're more compliant. So we built our own infrastructure, and in Africa, we have our own network of banks and subsidiaries that we work with to accept local currency payments. Internationally, as we announced just 2 weeks ago in Forbes, we partner with brokers such as SBI Remit to make a currency pair, directly Japanese yen and Ugandan shilling, without using SWIFT in between. In this situation, we're still using Bitcoin. About 20% of our transactions right now still use Bitcoin, and the rest go through our own proprietary network. So this pooling model, like I said, to increase liquidity is not new. There have been informal brokers doing this for generations. You can circulate domestic currencies, maybe in Uganda, by accepting payments from some corporates that want to sell, paying other corporates out. Similarly, having a broker in Japan or Europe through our network to have the same kind of matching model. You avoid buying USD, you avoid using the US system, you actually boost growth because you attract more businesses to transact in these currencies, and you can match flows without having a risk at the end of the day. So what we did is we showed that using this pooling model that's existed for generations and using technology, we can collect information to know who our customers are as well as the banks. So IDs, address, date of birth. We can scan for politically exposed. We can scan for sanctions. We can use all of the same bank-level compliance and more. We can understand the source of funds, the use of funds, collect all the documentation per each transaction, and really search for suspicious activity in a way that never even existed. We were the first company to submit a suspicious activity report in East Africa. And what happened was, as time went on, in 2013, we were the first company to bring this model to the central bank, and they weren't ready for it. But in the last 5 years, we went ahead and got the first FCA license in the UK for a company doing this business model. And in 2015, we exported that over and then incorporated in Luxembourg. And this year, we purchased our company, Transfer Zero, in Spain and got a Bank of Spain license. Now we have applications in across 4 countries in Africa, and we sit on several regulatory committees advising the central banks on how to use this model. So we've proven that by taking a traditional disruptive model, which might have been considered informal or outside the banking system, adding a layer of technology and startup grit, showed we could lower the cost, increase service, promote local currencies, and really revolutionize the way that we use local currencies in international trade. And here we are, the African growth story. Even though 15 million is not a lot of funding for a European startup, we are one of the top 10 most well-funded VC-backed startups on the African continent. We have offices across Africa and Europe with 70 employees with every possible nationality and religion. We've had 20x transactional growth each year, and we're now done transactions in 85 countries in over 20 currencies. This year we won the Technology Pioneer Award from the World Economic Forum. We've been recognized by the London Stock Exchange as a company to inspire, and we've shown time and time again. And now we consult with the IMF, with the same team that 5 years ago told us the only way that you're cheaper is you must be illegal. And we said, oh really? So what it really comes down to is breaking down what are these compliance requirements? What are the regulations? Is it really so impossible? What is this barrier to entry? We often say it's hard to do business in an economy. We also say it's hard to jump over that barrier. When you break it down into bit by bit and using examples that already exist, local models that work, you can show that you can scale a business and change and disrupt the way business has been done. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And before you jet off, I'll just ask you one very quick question. So you mentioned there that what you're doing with the pooling and so on has traditionally been done in kind of informal ways, maybe a bit of a grey area, maybe got a reputation for not quite being legitimate. How do you change that reputation and put yourself forward as a legitimate way of doing something that has been done sort of
Yeah, it's really technology. So pooling across long distances was only really possible if you had a very strong level of trust, which was almost always in a family, or maybe a tribal or ethnic group. So you always saw it in the Somalis between Mogadishu and Minnesota, for example, where you could trust within the community. Now, how do you get past that? How do you expand trust beyond a familiar way? And that's one of the things that the Bitcoin blockchain does. That's another thing that technology does. When you have the same companies using the same software, the same AML KYC startups, using the same kind of systems, you can get past the need for the familiar trust level.